August 2nd, 216 BC. A summer afternoon in southern Italy. The sun beats down on a dusty plain near a village called Cannae. The air is thick with dust. Two armies face each other across a flat expanse of farmland. One of them will be almost completely annihilated before sunset. In the next few hours, roughly 100 Roman soldiers will fall every single minute. 100 men every 60 seconds for hours on end. That is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. 100 deaths per minute. Try to imagine it. By the time you finish watching this video, thousands would have already died. By sunset, somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 Romans will lie dead on this field. The largest army Rome has ever assembled, gone. It will be the second deadliest single day of combat in Western military history, 7 times more deaths than the Battle of Gettysburg. In just one afternoon, this is the story of the Battle of Cannae, the worst defeat in Roman history, and perhaps the most perfect tactical victory any general has ever achieved. But it is also a story about a paradox, because the man who wins today will lose the war, and the nation that loses today will rule the world. The winner's name is Hannibal Barca, and his story begins not on a battlefield, but in a temple when he was just 10 years old. To understand Cannae, we first need to understand why Hannibal hated Rome so much that he dedicated his entire life to destroying them completely. It all started with his father, Hannibal Barca, one of Carthage's greatest generals, a man who fought Rome in the First Punic War and lost everything. Carthage was a trading empire based in North Africa, in what is now Tunisia. They controlled much of the Western Mediterranean for centuries before Rome rose. The First Punic War lasted 23 years, from 264 to 241 BC. It was fought mostly over Sicily, and Carthage lost badly. Rome took Sicily, forced Carthage to pay enormous war reparations, and humiliated them. Hamilcar never forgot, he never forgave, and he made sure his son wouldn't either. In a temple in Carthage, Hamilcar made his 10-year-old son place his hand on the altar and swear an oath of eternal hatred against Rome. That boy was Hannibal. And that oath would shape the next 40 years of Mediterranean history in ways no one could have possibly predicted at the time. Hamilcar took young Hannibal to Spain, where Carthage was building a new empire to replace what they lost. Hannibal grew up among soldiers, learning war firsthand. When Hamilcar died, command passed to Hannibal's brother-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair. When Hasdrubal was assassinated, the army chose Hannibal as their new leader. He was 26 years old. He had spent his entire life preparing for one thing: to fulfill the oath he made as a child and bring Rome to its knees. In 218 BC, Hannibal made his move. He attacked Saguntum, a Roman ally in Spain, knowing full well that Rome would have to respond with force. The siege of Saguntum lasted 8 months. The city's defenders fought with desperate courage, but in the end, Hannibal took it. Now there could be no turning back. Rome declared war. The Second Punic War had begun. But instead of waiting for Roman legions to come to Spain, Hannibal did something no one expected. He decided to invade Italy itself. Not by sea, where Roman ships controlled the waters, but by land, through the Alps, a route everyone thought was impossible. No army had ever crossed the Alps before. The mountains were a wall of ice and rock, patrolled by hostile tribes who would attack any outsiders trying to pass through. Hannibal gathered an army of about 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. Then he started marching north toward the mountains. The journey was brutal from the start. Hostile Gauls attacked the army constantly. Men deserted, supplies ran low, and the worst was yet to come. The crossing of the Alps took about 2 weeks and cost Hannibal nearly half his army. Men died from cold, from falls, from ambushes by hostile mountain tribes. Paths crumbled beneath their feet. Avalanches swept men into chasms. The elephants, terrified by the cold and the narrow ledges, sometimes refused to move at all. Most of the elephants perished too. But Hannibal made it through. In late 218 BC, he descended into northern Italy with a battle-hardened army. The Romans were shocked. They expected to fight in Spain, not in their own backyard. They scrambled to put together an army to stop this unexpected invasion. At the Trebia River in December 218 BC, Hannibal gave the Romans their first taste of his tactical genius. He lured them into a trap and crushed them. The Romans lost about 20,000 men at Trebia. It was a disaster, but Rome was confident they could recover. After all, they had unlimited manpower, right? Wrong. In the spring of 217 BC, Hannibal set another trap at Lake Trasimene. He hid his army in the morning fog and ambushed the Romans as they marched by. Trasimene was even worse than Trebia. The Roman consul Flaminius was killed along with 15,000 of his men. Another 10,000 were captured alive. In less than a year, Hannibal had killed or captured roughly 50,000 Roman soldiers. Panic began to spread through Rome. Something had to change. Rome appointed a dictator named Fabius Maximus to deal with the crisis. Fabius had a simple strategy: avoid battle, shadow Hannibal, and wear him down slowly over time. This strategy worked, but it was deeply unpopular. Romans wanted revenge. They wanted to see Hannibal destroyed, not just followed around Italy like a dangerous shadow. The Roman people grew impatient. They mocked Fabius, calling him the delayer. They wanted action, and in 216 BC they thought they found the men to deliver it. 2 new consuls were elected, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus. Rome gave them a mission: raise the largest army in Roman history and destroy Hannibal. Varro came from a humble background, the son of a butcher, some sources claim. He was ambitious, aggressive, and eager to prove himself against Rome's greatest enemy. Paulus was more cautious, a veteran of previous wars who understood the danger Hannibal represented. But under Roman law, the consuls had to share command, alternating daily. Rome mobilized 8 legions instead of the usual 4. With allied troops included, the total force numbered around 86,000 men, an unprecedented number. Think about that for a moment. 86,000 soldiers, more than Rome had ever put in one place before, all focused on a single objective: killing Hannibal. The Romans were confident. How could they lose? They outnumbered Hannibal almost 2 to 1. In the brutal arithmetic of ancient warfare, numbers usually meant victory. But Hannibal had something the Romans didn't understand. He had a plan. And that plan would turn Rome's greatest strength into their fatal weakness. In the spring of 216 BC, Hannibal seized the supply depot at Cannae, a small fortress town in southern Italy that controlled grain supplies for the entire region. This was a deliberate provocation. By taking Cannae, Hannibal was threatening Roman supply lines and daring them to come fight him on ground of his choosing. The Roman consuls took the bait. They marched south with their massive army, determined to finally end the Carthaginian threat once and for all in a single, decisive battle. After several days of maneuvering, both armies found themselves facing each other across a flat plain near the Aufidus River. The stage was set for confrontation. On August 2nd, 216 BC, Varro was in command. He wanted to attack immediately, to use Rome's numerical superiority to simply overwhelm the Carthaginian line. Paulus had advised caution, but Varro overruled him. The Roman legions formed up for battle, massed in unusually deep formations designed to punch through the enemy's center. Hannibal watched from across the field. He had about 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry, roughly half the Roman numbers. But he knew exactly what he was doing. The morning sun rose behind the Carthaginians, shining directly into Roman eyes. A hot wind, called the Libecchio, blew dust and grit into Roman faces as they advanced. These weren't accidents. Hannibal had chosen this ground precisely because of these advantages. He was using the sun and wind as weapons before the first sword was even drawn. Hannibal arranged his army in an unusual formation. His center bulged forward in a crescent shape with his weakest troops, Gauls and Spaniards, at the very front. On either flank, slightly behind the front line, he placed his best infantry, the Libyan veterans. They carried Roman weapons captured from Trebia and Trasimene. On the wings, he positioned his cavalry. On the left, near the river, he placed his heavy cavalry under his brother Hasdrubal. On the right, his Numidian light horsemen. The Romans approached in a massive block, infantry in the center, cavalry on the wings. Their plan was simple: use their weight of numbers to smash through Hannibal's line. It was exactly what Hannibal wanted them to do. The trap was set. All he needed was for the Romans to walk into it, and they were marching forward with perfect confidence. The battle began with cavalry clashes on both flanks. Near the river, Hasdrubal's heavy cavalry crashed into the Roman horsemen in brutal close-quarters combat. The Romans fought bravely, but they were outnumbered on this wing. Within minutes, Hasdrubal had shattered the Roman left cavalry and sent them fleeing from the battlefield. In the center, the Roman infantry advanced against Hannibal's Crescent. The Gauls and Spaniards in the Carthaginian center began to give ground, slowly retreating backward. This is what the Romans expected. Push hard enough, and the enemy breaks. They surged forward, sensing victory, pressing deeper and deeper into the retreating center. But the retreat was controlled. Hannibal was there himself, in the thick of it, keeping his men together, making sure they fell back in good order rather than routing. As the Romans pushed forward, the crescent shape began to invert. What had been a bulge forward was becoming a pocket, with Romans pouring into the center from all sides. On the far wing, the Numidian cavalry kept the Roman allied horsemen occupied, unable to help their comrades in the center. It was a masterful delaying action. Meanwhile, Hasdrubal did something unexpected. Instead of pursuing the fleeing Roman cavalry, he wheeled his horsemen around behind the Roman infantry line and hit the allied cavalry from the rear. The allied cavalry, already struggling against the Numidians, now found themselves attacked from both directions. They broke and fled, leaving the Roman infantry completely exposed. Now came the decisive moment. The Libyan infantry on both flanks, who had been waiting patiently, suddenly wheeled inward and attacked the Roman flanks simultaneously. The trap snapped shut. Romans who moments ago were pushing forward victoriously now found themselves surrounded on three sides, with Hasdrubal's cavalry closing the fourth. And here was the terrible irony. The Romans were so packed together, so compressed by their own numbers, that most of them couldn't even raise their swords to fight. Imagine it. 80,000 men crushed together so tightly that they could barely move. The soldiers in the middle couldn't fight, couldn't flee, could only wait to die. Hannibal had turned Rome's greatest advantage, their overwhelming numbers, into a death trap. The more men the Romans had, the less room each one had to defend himself. The slaughter that followed lasted for hours. Carthaginian soldiers worked their way through the trapped Romans like farmers harvesting wheat, cutting them down methodically. There was nowhere to run. The cavalry blocked escape to the rear. The Libyan infantry pressed in from the sides. The center was a killing ground with no exit. Roman soldiers tried to form small groups to defend themselves, but there was no room to maneuver. They could not even raise their shields properly in the crush of bodies. Some threw down their weapons and tried to surrender, but in the chaos of battle, few prisoners were taken. The killing continued hour after hour under the blazing Italian sun. The Roman historian Livy, writing 2 centuries later, described the horror in detail. Some Romans were found alive with their legs slashed, unable to stand, begging for death. Others were discovered with their heads buried in holes they had dug themselves. They had apparently pushed dirt over their own faces to suffocate rather than wait for the end. The consul Paulus fought until the very last. Covered in wounds, he refused an offer of escape. He chose to die among his soldiers rather than survive their destruction. Varro escaped with about 50 men. The man who had commanded 86,000 soldiers fled the battlefield with fewer people than would fill a small room today. By sunset, the killing was mostly done. The ancient sources disagree on exact numbers, but somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 Romans lay dead on the field. Polybius, the most reliable ancient historian, says 70,000 infantry were killed, with only 3,000 escaping. Of 6,000 cavalry, only 370 survived. Livy gives slightly lower numbers, around 48,000 dead. Modern historians sometimes suggest even lower figures, perhaps 30,000, but even that is catastrophic. The losses went beyond ordinary soldiers. 80 men of senatorial rank were killed, including former consuls and other high officials. 29 of 48 military tribunes died. In a single afternoon, Rome lost perhaps 1/5 of all its adult male citizens, 1 in every 5 Roman men of military age, gone in the time between sunrise and sunset. To put this in perspective, this was roughly equivalent to the casualties the British Army suffered on the first day of the Battle of the Somme in 1916. Some historians estimate that at the height of the killing, roughly 100 Romans were dying every minute. The battlefield would have been an ocean of blood and screaming. Hannibal's losses were comparatively light. He lost about 6,000 men, mostly Gauls, who had borne the brunt of the initial Roman assault in the centre. The ratio of casualties was staggering. For every Carthaginian who died, roughly 10 Romans perished. It was the most lopsided major battle in ancient history. When news reached Rome, the city descended into panic. Women filled the temples, weeping for husbands and sons. The streets echoed with lamentations and cries of despair. In their terror, the Romans did something extraordinary. They performed human sacrifice, burying 2 Greeks and 2 Gauls alive to appease the gods they believed had abandoned them. They also lowered the military age, enrolled slaves into the army with promises of freedom, and rejected Hannibal's offer to ransom the Roman prisoners. Rome would not negotiate. And here we come to the strangest part of the story. Hannibal had just won the most complete tactical victory in ancient history. Rome was defenseless, the path to the city lay open. His cavalry commander Maharbal urged him to march on Rome immediately. "Give me 5 days," Maharbal said, "and you will dine as victor on the Capitoline Hill." Hannibal refused. His army was tired, he said. He lacked siege equipment. The walls of Rome were strong. There were many reasons, all of them reasonable, none of them satisfying. Maharbal's response has echoed through history for over 2,000 years. "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal," he said, "but you do not know how to use one." Whether Hannibal made the right decision remains one of the great debates in military history. Could he have taken Rome? We will never know for certain, but probably not. Rome's walls were formidable. Even after Cannae, the city could muster a defense. And Hannibal had no siege train, no equipment designed for assaulting fortified cities. But Maharbal's criticism contained a deeper truth. Hannibal had expected his victories to shatter Rome's alliance system, to make Rome's Italian allies abandon them and join Carthage. Some did. Capua, the second largest city in Italy, defected to Hannibal. So did Tarentum and several other southern cities. But most of Rome's allies stayed loyal, and Rome itself refused to break. Instead of surrendering, the Senate thanked Varro for not despairing of the Republic. They began rebuilding their army immediately. There would be no negotiations, there would be no peace. Rome had lost a battle, perhaps the worst battle in their history, but they had not lost their will to fight. The Senate passed emergency measures. They lowered the military age to 17. They armed slaves with captured weapons and promised them freedom if they fought well. They even freed criminals from prison and put swords in their hands. Rome would scrape the bottom of every barrel to find men who could hold a weapon and face the enemy. Within a month of Cannae, Rome had 4 new legions in the field, even if they were composed of freed slaves, convicts, and boys too young for normal military service. It was a remarkable display of resilience. Any other nation would have sued for peace after a defeat like Cannae. But Rome was not any other nation. This was Rome's real superpower, not their legions or their tactics, but their absolute refusal to accept defeat. They would fight until they won or until they ceased to exist. Hannibal remained in Italy for another 15 years after Cannae. He won more battles, captured more cities, and killed more Romans. But he never won the war. Rome adopted a new strategy, the same one Fabius had proposed before Cannae. They avoided pitched battles with Hannibal while attacking Carthaginian interests elsewhere. They reconquered the cities that had defected. They sent armies to Spain, where they destroyed Carthaginian power. They built a fleet and took the war to Africa itself. In 202 BC, a Roman general named Scipio Africanus defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama in North Africa. The war that had begun with Cannae ended with Carthage's surrender. Hannibal went into exile, wandering from court to court, always pursued by Roman agents who demanded his extradition. In 183 BC, cornered at last, he took poison. His final words, according to legend, were bitter. "Let us now put an end to the great anxiety of the Romans, who have thought it too lengthy to wait for the death of a hated old man." The man who had won the greatest tactical victory in history died alone, far from home, his lifelong mission unfulfilled. Rome, the nation he had nearly destroyed, ruled the world. And yet, in a strange way, Hannibal won something greater than a war. He won immortality. His battle at Cannae became the standard by which all other battles are measured. For 2,000 years, military commanders have studied Cannae, trying to understand how Hannibal achieved the impossible, trying to recreate his double envelopment. The double envelopment, surrounding an enemy and attacking from all sides at once, became the holy grail of military tactics. Every great general dreamed of achieving their own Cannae. Frederick the Great studied Cannae. So did Napoleon, who reportedly walked through Alpine passes just to trace Hannibal's footsteps. The great captains all wanted to be like him. Napoleon said that Hannibal was the greatest general of all time. He studied Cannae obsessively, trying to understand how one man could achieve such perfect tactical execution. In the 19th century, a Prussian military historian named Hans Delbrück published a detailed analysis of Cannae that would change the course of modern warfare. Delbrück argued that Cannae proved a fundamental truth of warfare, that a smaller force could destroy a larger one through superior tactics and leadership. Delbrück's work caught the attention of Alfred von Schlieffen, chief of the German General Staff, who became obsessed with the idea of recreating Cannae against France. Schlieffen was facing a nightmare scenario. Germany was surrounded by enemies, France to the west and Russia to the east. He needed a way to defeat them both quickly. Schlieffen spent years developing what became known as the Schlieffen Plan, a massive wheeling movement through Belgium designed to encircle the French army from behind. The plan was essentially Cannae on a continental scale. Schlieffen even published a series of essays called Cannae Studies, analyzing how the principle could be applied to modern war. When World War I began in 1914, the Germans attempted to execute Schlieffen's vision. They came close to capturing Paris before the plan ultimately failed. The dream of Cannae persisted through World War II. German armoured tactics, the famous Blitzkrieg, were designed around the concept of encirclement and annihilation. In 1941, the Germans encircled and destroyed entire Soviet armies at battles like Kiev and Vyazma, killing or capturing millions of men in operations inspired by Cannae. Even after World War II, the influence continued. In 1991, General Norman Schwarzkopf openly admitted that his plan for Desert Storm was based on Cannae. Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in World War II and later President of the United States, wrote about Cannae's enduring influence on military thinking. "Every ground commander seeks the battle of annihilation," Eisenhower wrote. So far as conditions permit, he tries to duplicate in modern war the classic example of Cannae. Today, over 2,200 years after Hannibal's victory, Cannae is still taught at military academies around the world as the textbook example of tactical perfection. West Point, Sandhurst, St. Cyr, and every other major military academy studies Cannae. Officers learn to recognize its patterns and apply its principles to modern warfare. The battle has become more than history. It has become a template, a standard, a measuring stick against which all other tactical achievements are compared. But the deeper lesson of Cannae is not about tactics. It is about the difference between winning battles and winning wars, between tactical brilliance and strategic success. Hannibal showed us that even the most perfect victory is meaningless if it does not break your enemy's will to fight. And Rome's will was simply unbreakable. Hannibal won every major battle he fought in Italy. He killed over 150,000 Romans in just 20 months. He brought Rome closer to destruction than anyone before or after, and yet he lost. Rome's refusal to surrender, their ability to absorb catastrophic losses and keep fighting, proved more powerful than any battlefield genius. Cannae teaches us that there is no such thing as a knockout blow if your opponent refuses to stay down. Victory in war requires not just winning battles, but breaking the enemy's will. Rome learned from Cannae too. They reformed their military, adopting more flexible tactics. They gave their generals more independence. They became better by losing. The republic that nearly died at Cannae would go on to conquer the Mediterranean, destroy Carthage utterly, and build an empire that lasted for centuries. In that sense, Cannae was not just a Roman defeat. It was also a turning point, the moment when Rome discovered that nothing could destroy them except themselves. On a dusty plain in southern Italy, on one August afternoon over 2,000 years ago, roughly 70,000 men died in a few hours of terrible violence. The scale of it still defies comprehension. 70,000 lives ended in a single day on a field that today is just farmland, with nothing but a small museum to mark the spot. The man who killed them was a genius, perhaps the greatest tactical commander who ever lived. The nation that lost them refused to admit defeat and conquered the world, and the battle itself became immortal, studied and debated and admired by soldiers and historians for millennia, a single afternoon that still shapes how we think about war. That is the story of Cannae, a story of hatred and genius, of slaughter and survival, of the greatest victory that led to defeat and the worst defeat that led to empire. 2,000 years later, we still talk about it, we still study it, we still argue about what Hannibal should have done differently. That is the true measure of its importance. One summer afternoon in 216 BC, on a dusty plain in southern Italy, Hannibal Barca achieved immortality. The man died, but the battle lives forever.